So far we've learned about the circumference of circles and the parts of circles. Now we're going to learn about the area of circles. So the formula for the area of a circle is area equals pi r squared. And I want you to notice here that our circumference formula is 2 pi r. So there's a couple of ways to keep those two straight. Now I use logic because I am the kind of person that likes to use logic versus straight up memorization. And for logic, I think about it as area is actually about how many squares are inside of something. So area has to do with both length and width. So our units are going to be squared. So we have a squared in the formula. Whereas circumference is the distance around the figure. So if you take this circle and you open it up, you get just a straight line. So that's actually one dimension. It's just the dimension of length. So area is dealing with the dimension of length and width because it's how many squares are inside of our circle. And circumference is dealing with just length. Therefore, we're dealing with squared units with area, and we're dealing with just units to the first power with circumference. So I notice that both of my formulas have a pi, a r, and a 2 in them. And I just remembered that the 2 is the exponent when I'm looking at the area formula because I'm dealing with the second dimension there. So if you want to use a different way to keep these straight, you can use memorization, and there's this cute little saying. And here the formula for circumference that's being used is pi times d. So you can think of it as cherry, pies, delicious for circumference, and apple pies are 2 for area. Anyway, either way, there's a couple of different ways to memorize the formulas. The important thing is to remember that area is how many squares is inside a figure. So with area, you have to know what the radius is in order to find the area. So in this example, we're given the radius is 14 inches. So I'm going to write my formula. Then I'm going to substitute 14 in the place of my radius. And in my calculator, I'm often put in 14 squared and then pi because it doesn't really matter what order you multiply these in. So 14 squared times pi gives me 615, and I'm going to go ahead and round this to the tenth, so 615.8. Now since this is how many squares there are, our units will be squared, so that's inches squared. Another way to think about this when you're dealing with the units and coming up with the logic around units is pi r squared means that we have pi times 14 inches times 14 inches. So that's actually pi times 14 squared times inches squared. So this is where the inches squared comes from algebraically. So let's go down to our next example. Now in the next example, we do not actually have the radius. We have the diameter, and you have to have the radius to put it into pi r squared and find the area. So in this case, I'm going to take the diameter and I'm going to divide it by 2 because the diameter equals 2 times the radius. So 3.6 divided by 2 is going to be 1.8. Therefore, my radius is 1.8. Now I can use my formula. Area equals pi r squared, where our radius is 1.8. Again, just put that straight into your calculator. So I'm going to put in 1.8, hit x squared, multiply that times pi, round it to the tenths, and I get 10.2 inches squared. On the next page, you're given the area instead of the radius, and you're asked to find the radius. So as always, with any formula, we write our formula out, and then we substitute what we know. In this case, we know what the area is, so we substitute 314 in the place of A and solve. Our goal is to get pi or r by itself, so we're going to get rid of that pi by dividing both sides by pi. That leaves us with r squared on the right, and we need to divide 314 by pi on the left. So 314 divided by pi Wow, that number is really close to 100. So I'm just going to go ahead and round it to 100, and you'll see why that's helpful in a minute. So I'm going to get 314 divided by pi is 100, and on the other side of our equation we have r squared. Now if you'll remember, in order to get r squared into an r, we have to do the inverse operation of squaring, which is, you got it, square rooting. So we're going to take the square root of both sides, and in doing so, we end up with 10 equals r, or r equals 10 inches. And it's just inches because it's a line segment, since we're solving for radius. So we can see that rounding to 100 was really helpful here, so that we could take the square root of a perfect square. So go ahead and round if you get a number that's really close to a perfect square and you're setting it equal to r squared. That way you can take the square root. If it's not a perfect square, just write down what you get to the nearest tenths and then take the square root, and you'll end up with a decimal as your answer. So let's move on. So here, these are really great problems. I enjoy these a lot because they're very easy, and you don't even need a calculator. We're going to be finding answers in terms of pi, and what that means is you're going to leave the pi instead of multiplying the pi times the number. So let me show you how to do this. First of all, we're given that r equals 9, and we're going to figure out what the diameter, the circumference, and the area are based on that information. Well, we know that diameter is twice radius. Therefore, our diameter is 2 times 9 in this example, so our diameter is 18. We don't have a unit, so we can just leave 18. For circumference, to make it really easy, we're going to work with circumference equals pi d. Now, we know what our diameter is. Our diameter is 18. Now, we're going to leave our answer in terms of pi, and so what that means is I can just write that the circumference is equal to 18 pi. I don't need to multiply those together since I'm leaving the answer in terms of pi. So for area, we know that area is pi r squared, and all you need to know is your radius to figure this out, and we know that radius is 9. So the area is pi times 9 squared, which is going to be pi times 81. We can leave our answer in terms of pi, so we can leave the pi there and just write our area as a equals 81 pi. Pretty simple, huh? Now I'm showing steps here, but you don't really need to show any steps for these unless you want to. That's just to help you see the process. So let's go to the next page. Take a minute and try this yourself, and pause the video and then check back. So you should have ended up with 7 times 2 is 14 for your diameter. Circumference is the diameter times pi, so you should have 14 pi. And the area is the radius squared times pi, so you should have 49 pi. Now let's look at the next page. In this case, you're given the circumference instead of the radius. So let's think about what we can tell from the circumference. Well, since circumference is pi d, and we see 8 pi here, we know that d must be equal to 8. So our diameter is 8. So what do you think the radius is? 4, right? Half of that. And now that we know our radius, we can find our area. So plug your radius in the place of r, and you should get 16 pi. Let's go to the next page. This case, you're given area. So with area, what you're working with is radius. That's what we know in our formula. Well, here, our radius squared is 25. So how can we solve for r? You got it. We're going to take the square root, and r is 5. So now that you know that r is 5, take a minute and answer diameter and circumference and check back. So diameter is 10 because it's twice your radius, and circumference is going to be 10 pi because circumference is pi d, the diameter times pi. Let's go to our next problem. So on our next problem, we're going to do an example where you're given the circumference of a circle, and you're asked to find the area. So let's think about what you need to know to find the area. Well, our area formula is pi r squared. So what we need to know is the radius. Well, can we find the radius if we're given the circumference? Sure we can, because we can work with the formula circumference equals 2 pi r and solve for the radius. So let's use this formula and substitute in what we know, which is the circumference. Their circumference is 300, and we're solving for r. So to get r by itself, we're going to divide both sides by 2 pi. If you will remember from circumference, when you're solving for r given the circumference and you divide both sides by 2 pi, you have to make sure when you divide by 2 pi that you do what? Put it in parentheses, right? Otherwise, by order of operations, if you don't have the parentheses, your calculator is going to divide by 2 and then multiply by pi instead of dividing by what's approximately 6. 2 times 3 here, approximately 6. And we want it to multiply first and then divide, so we need our parentheses. So when we put this in our calculator, we're going to put in 300 divided by 2 pi in parentheses, and since I don't have parentheses on this one, I'm actually going to do 2 pi, hit enter, and I'll round that to 6.3. So I'm actually doing 300 divided by 6.3, which will be a little bit less exact than if I had the calculator we use in class, our handheld one. So 300 divided by 6.3 is 47.6 centimeters, since this is radius. And I believe if you have your calculator, you end up with 47.7. So now we're going to plug this into our area formula. So area equals pi times the radius we just figured out, 47.6 squared. And you just put that straight into your calculator. So I'm actually going to hit x squared there, and then times pi. I get 7,123.8. And since it's area, our units will be what? Squared, right? That is the end of your area video.